The whispers started the moment Helena Turner stepped off the stagecoach in Benton, Montana territory, her copper-red hair catching the afternoon sun like a living flame. The year was 1876, and Benton was a rough mining town carved into the wilderness, where superstition ran as deep as the ore veins in the surrounding mountains. Helena had come seeking refuge after her father's death left her with nothing but debts in Chicago. Her Aunt Margaret, a widow who ran a boarding house on the edge of town, had written offering her a place to stay and work. It seemed like providence at the time, but now, watching the faces of the townspeople turn cold and suspicious as they stared at her hair, Helena wondered if she had made a terrible mistake. "Red hair," she heard an old woman mutter to her companion. "Mark of the devil, that is." Helena kept her chin high, though her stomach twisted with anxiety. She had heard such things before, whispered behind hands in Chicago, but never so openly. Her father had always told her that her hair was her mother's legacy, beautiful as a sunset. But her mother had died when Helena was only 3, and her father had followed 6 months ago, leaving her utterly alone in the world. The boarding house sat at the western edge of town, a 2-story structure with peeling white paint and a sagging porch. Aunt Margaret met her at the door, a thin woman with graying hair pulled severely back from her face. Her eyes, however, held warmth when she looked at Helena. "You have your mother's hair," Margaret said, pulling Helena into an embrace that smelled of lye soap and lavender. "I am so glad you came, child. The journey must have been exhausting." "It was long," Helena admitted, following her aunt inside. The boarding house was clean but worn, the furniture showing signs of heavy use. "Thank you for taking me in." "Nonsense. You are family." Margaret's expression grew serious. "But I must warn you, Helena. This town can be cruel to anyone different. Your hair will draw attention." "It already has," Helena said quietly. Over the following days, Helena learned the truth of her aunt's words. When she walked to the general store, conversations would stop. Women pulled their children away from her. Men stared with either suspicion or an uncomfortable hunger that made her skin crawl. The local preacher, Reverend Cartwright, a man with a face like a hatchet and eyes that burned with righteous fervor, had actually pointed at her on the street and declared that red hair was a sign of moral corruption. "The mark of Eve's sin," he proclaimed loudly enough for half the town to hear. "Such women bring nothing but temptation and ruin to God-fearing folk." Helena had hurried past, her face burning with humiliation. That night, lying in the narrow bed in the tiny room her aunt had provided, she wept into her pillow. She had traveled 1,000 miles only to find herself more alone than ever. But Helena was not one to surrender easily. Her father had taught her to stand tall in the face of adversity. So she held her head high, helped her aunt with the boarding house, and tried to ignore the whispers that followed her like a dark shadow. She took to wearing her hair in a tight bun, covered with a bonnet whenever she went out, but it made little difference. The damage was done. To Benton, Montana territory, she was the red-haired woman, the possible witch, the outsider to be feared and shunned. 3 weeks after her arrival, on a crisp October morning, a man unlike any Helena had ever seen walked into the general store where she was purchasing supplies for the boarding house. He stood at least 6 feet 3 inches tall, with shoulders so broad they nearly filled the doorway. His arms, visible beneath rolled-up sleeves despite the autumn chill, were corded with muscle that spoke of years of hard physical labor. His hair, dark brown and wavy, hung past his collar, and a thick beard covered the lower half of his face. He wore buckskin clothing and carried himself with the easy confidence of someone utterly comfortable in his own skin. The store owner, Mr. Hutchins, greeted him warmly. "Zane, good to see you down from the mountain. What brings you to civilization?" The mountain man's voice was deep and rich, like distant thunder. "Need salt, ammunition, and a few other supplies. Winter's coming early this year, I can feel it." "Your instincts are usually right," Hutchins said. "Let me get your usual order together." Helena tried not to stare, but it was difficult. The man called Zane moved through the store with deliberate grace, examining goods with careful attention. When he reached for a tin of coffee on a high shelf, the muscles in his arm flexed impressively. He must have felt her gaze because he turned suddenly, and their eyes met. His eyes were a startling gray-blue, like storm clouds over the mountains. For a long moment, he simply looked at her, and Helena felt heat rise to her cheeks. Unlike everyone else in town, his expression held no suspicion, no judgment, just frank curiosity. "Morning, miss," he said, touching the brim of his hat. "Good morning," Helena managed, her voice barely above a whisper. Mr. Hutchins called from behind the counter, breaking the spell. "Zane, your order is ready." The mountain man nodded to Helena once more and moved to the counter. But as Helena gathered her own purchases, she could feel his occasional glances in her direction. It was not the uncomfortable staring she had endured from other men in town. This felt different, somehow more respectful, almost protective. As she prepared to pay for her goods, Mr. Hutchins frowned at her. "That will be $12 even," he said, naming a price significantly higher than what the goods should have cost. Helena's heart sank. She knew he was taking advantage of her, likely hoping she would not know any better. But she had helped her father with his accounts and knew exactly what things should cost. "I believe the correct total is $8.75, she said firmly. Hutchins's face darkened. "Are you calling me a liar, girl?" "I am saying there must be an error in your calculation," Helena replied, trying to keep her voice steady despite her racing heart. "No woman with devil's hair is going to tell me how to run my business," Hutchins snarled. "Pay the $12 or get out." Before Helena could respond, a large hand placed coins on the counter with a decisive clink. "The lady is right," Zane Prescott's deep voice cut through the tension like an axe through wood. "The total comes to $8.75. I counted it myself while you were adding it up." Hutchins's face turned an interesting shade of purple. "Now see here, Zane. I see a man trying to cheat a woman because she is new in town and folks have been unkind to her," Zane said, his tone still calm but with an edge of steel underneath. "That does not sit right with me, Hutchins." "Never figured you for that type." The store owner deflated slightly under the mountain man's steady gaze. "Fine," he muttered, scooping up the coins. $8.75. Helena quickly counted out the correct amount, her hands trembling slightly. "Thank you," she said to Zane, gathering her packages. "Let me help you with those," he offered, already reaching for the heavier items. His size made the burden look like nothing. Outside, the autumn air was crisp and clean, carrying the scent of pine from the surrounding mountains. Helena walked quickly, very aware of the tall man beside her. She could feel eyes watching them from windows and doorways, and she knew the gossip would be flying within the hour. "I am Helena Turner," she said finally, breaking the silence. "I live at my aunt's boarding house with her." "Zane Prescott," he replied. "I have a cabin up in the high country about 15 miles north of here. Do not come down to town much except for supplies." "I can see why," Helena said with unexpected bitterness. "The people here are not exactly welcoming." Zane glanced down at her, and she was struck again by the intelligence in those storm-colored eyes. "They are afraid of what they do not understand. Your hair." He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. "It is beautiful, like autumn leaves catching firelight. But folks here tend toward superstition." Helena stopped walking, stunned. In all her life, she had never heard anyone describe her hair so poetically, with such genuine appreciation rather than suspicion or unwanted desire. "You do not think it is the mark of a witch?" "I think it is hair," Zane said simply. "Just happens to be a pretty color." He paused, then added, "I have spent the last 8 years living alone in the mountains, miss. I have seen sunrises that painted the sky 100 shades of gold. I have watched eagles soar and wolves run and rivers cut through solid stone. Your hair reminds me of the aspens in autumn, and I have never met a tree that could cast spells." Despite everything, Helena laughed. It was the first genuine laugh she had experienced since arriving in Benton, and it felt wonderful. "That is quite possibly the nicest thing anyone has said to me in a very long time." They had reached the boarding house. Zane set down the packages on the porch, his movements careful despite his obvious strength. "The world can be cruel to people who stand out," he said. "But standing out is not always a bad thing. Sometimes it just means you shine brighter than the rest." Margaret appeared in the doorway, her eyes widening slightly at the sight of the large mountain man. "Helena, is everything all right?" "Yes, Aunt Margaret, this is Mr. Prescott. He helped me carry the supplies from the store." Margaret's expression softened with recognition. "Zane Prescott. Your father was James Prescott, was he not? He used to trap these mountains years ago." "Yes, madam," Zane said respectfully. "He taught me everything I know before he passed. I took over his cabin and his trapping routes." "He was a good man," Margaret said. "Would you like to come in for coffee?" Zane hesitated, glancing at Helena. Something in his expression made her heart skip strangely. "I would appreciate that, thank you." The boarding house kitchen was warm and homey, a contrast to the cold reception Helena usually received in town. Margaret poured coffee while Helena sliced bread and brought out preserves. Zane sat at the large wooden table, looking somewhat out of place in the domestic setting but not uncomfortable. "How long have you been in Benton, Miss Turner?" he asked, wrapping his large hands around the coffee cup. 3 weeks, Helena said, though it feels much longer. "The town has not been kind," Margaret interjected. "People can be foolish about things like red hair." Zane's jaw tightened beneath his beard. "I have noticed. Hutchins was not the first to give you trouble, I am guessing." "The Reverend Cartwright seems particularly convinced I am some sort of corrupting influence," Helena admitted, surprised at how easy it was to talk to this quiet mountain man. "Though I have done nothing but help my aunt with the boarding house and try to mind my own business." "Cartwright is a self-righteous fool," Zane said bluntly. "Pardon my language, but it is the truth. He sees sin everywhere because it makes him feel important to point it out." They talked for over an hour, and Helena found herself fascinated by Zane's stories of life in the high country. He spoke of tracking elk through snow-covered forests, of reading weather in the behavior of animals, of the profound silence that came with winter in the mountains. His love for the wilderness was evident in every word, and Helena could not help but be drawn to his passion and his quiet strength. When he finally rose to leave, the afternoon sun was slanting through the windows. "I should head back before dark," he said, "but I want to thank you for the coffee and the company. It has been a long time since I sat at a table with friendly folks." "You are welcome here any time," Margaret said warmly. "It is nice to see someone treat my niece with simple human decency." Zane looked at Helena, and again that strange connection sparked between them. "Your beauty outshines every sunset I have ever seen in these mountains, Miss Turner," he said quietly. "Do not let small-minded people make you think otherwise." Before Helena could find words to respond, he was gone, his tall figure striding down the street toward the livery where he had apparently stabled his horse. She stood at the window, watching him go, her heart beating faster than it should. "That," Margaret said from behind her, "is a good man." "They are rare as hen's teeth these days." "He is kind," Helena agreed, though the word felt inadequate to describe the way Zane Prescott made her feel safe and seen in a way she had not felt in a very long time. That night, lying in bed, Helena could not stop thinking about storm-colored eyes and a voice like distant thunder saying her beauty outshone every sunset. It seemed impossible that after 3 weeks of isolation and cruelty, one man could make her feel so valued with just a few words and simple kindness. The next morning brought unwelcome developments. Helena was sweeping the front porch when Reverend Cartwright appeared, his thin face set in stern lines, accompanied by 3 women from his congregation. "Miss Turner," he said without preamble, "I have come to discuss your influence on this town." Helena set down the broom, her heart sinking. "What influence would that be, Reverend?" "You have been seen in the company of men unchaperoned," one of the women, Mrs. Dalton, said sharply. "Yesterday that mountain man was observed carrying your packages and entering this establishment." "Mr. Prescott helped me with heavy supplies and accepted my aunt's offer of coffee," Helena said, fighting to keep her voice level. "There is nothing improper in that." "A decent woman would not attract such attention," Cartwright intoned. "Your very appearance suggests moral laxity." "I am here to strongly suggest that you attend church services this Sunday and publicly repent for whatever sins brought you to our town." Anger flared hot in Helena's chest. "I have committed no sins, Reverend. I came here because my father died and left me with nowhere else to go. If wanting to survive makes me sinful in your eyes, then your God and mine are very different." Cartwright's face darkened. "You will not speak to me in such a manner, girl. Mark my words, if you continue on this path, you will bring nothing but trouble to yourself and anyone foolish enough to associate with you." They left in a flurry of righteous indignation, but the damage was done. Helena's hands shook as she picked up the broom again. Margaret appeared in the doorway, her face troubled. "I am so sorry, child," she said. "I had hoped they would leave you alone if you kept to yourself." "I have kept to myself," Helena said, close to tears, "but it makes no difference. They have decided what I am, and nothing I do will change their minds." The days that followed were even harder. Mrs. Dalton and her friends spread word that Helena was a corrupting influence, possibly a witch, certainly someone to be avoided. The few customers who had been staying at the boarding house found excuses to leave. Business dried up. When Helena went to the store, people literally crossed the street to avoid her. 2 weeks after her encounter with Reverend Cartwright, Helena was gathering water from the town well when a group of boys, emboldened by their parents' prejudice, began throwing stones at her. They called her witch and devil's daughter, laughing as she tried to shield herself with her arms. One stone caught her on the temple, and she felt warm blood trickle down her face. "Stop that right now!" A woman's voice rang out, and Helena looked up through tears to see Mrs. Chen, who ran the laundry with her husband. The elderly Chinese woman marched toward the boys with a raised fist. "You shame your parents. Go home." The boys scattered, but not before one yelled, "Your people are not wanted here either, old woman." Mrs. Chen helped Helena to her feet with surprisingly strong hands. "Come, we clean your wound." In the Chen's small but spotlessly clean home behind the laundry, Mrs. Chen tended to Helena's cut with gentle efficiency. "I know how it feels," she said quietly, "to be different, to be blamed for things you cannot control." "How do you bear it?" Helena asked. "I have my husband. We have each other, and I know in my heart I am not what they say I am." Mrs. Chen looked at Helena with wise, dark eyes. "You need someone too. Everyone needs someone." Helena thought of Zane Prescott, of his kind words and protective presence, but he was up in his mountain cabin living his life. She could not expect him to come to her rescue every time the town showed its cruel side. He had his own life to live. But as if her thoughts had summoned him, 2 days later, Zane appeared at the boarding house door with a deer he had hunted, offering it to Margaret for her kitchen. His eyes found Helena immediately, and she saw them narrow at the fading bruise on her temple. What happened? His voice was dangerously quiet. Some boys throwing stones, Helena said, trying to sound dismissive. It is nothing. It is not nothing. Zane stepped closer, his size suddenly feeling protective rather than intimidating. Did anyone stop them? Mrs. Chen did. Good for her. He looked at Margaret. With your permission, madam, I would like to take your niece for a walk. I promised to have her back within the hour and to behave as a complete gentleman. Margaret looked between them, then nodded. I trust you, Zane, but do not go far. Tongues wag easily in this town. We will stay where we can be seen, Zane promised. They walked to the edge of town where the buildings gave way to grassland, and the mountains rose in the distance, purple and majestic against the October sky. Zane was silent for a while, his long strides eating up the ground until Helena had to ask him to slow down. Sorry, he said, moderating his pace. I am angry and I walk faster when I am angry. You barely know me, Helena said. Why would you be angry on my behalf? Zane stopped walking and turned to face her fully. The wind caught his long hair, and in that moment, with the mountains behind him and the autumn sun catching in his beard, he looked like some ancient warrior out of a story. Because it is wrong, he said simply. Because you have done nothing to deserve this treatment. Because every time I think about you facing this alone, something in my chest tightens up until I can barely breathe. He paused, then added more quietly, and because from the moment I saw you in that store, I have not been able to stop thinking about you. Helena's breath caught. I think about you too, she admitted. But Zane, you live up in the mountains, I live here. And even if there was something between us, the town would make your life miserable too. I cannot ask you to take that on. You are not asking, I am offering. He reached out and gently touched her cheek, his calloused fingers surprisingly gentle. I know we barely know each other. I know this is fast. But I have spent 8 years alone in those mountains, and I never once felt lonely until I met you and realized what I was missing. I am not a fancy man, Helena. I cannot offer you much except a rough cabin and a hard life, but I can offer you safety and respect and a place where no one will call you a witch for the color of your hair. Helena felt tears prick her eyes. You are offering me everything that matters, she whispered. Then say you will consider it, Zane urged. I have to go back up to the cabin tonight, but I will be back in 2 weeks. That gives you time to think, to be sure. If you decide this is what you want, I will take you up there, and we can be married by the circuit judge when he comes through next month. Married? Helena's voice came out as a squeak. Zane's bearded face split in a smile that transformed his rough features. I am old-fashioned that way. If you are going to live in my cabin, you are going to be my wife. Unless you do not want that, I want that, Helena said, the certainty in her voice surprising even herself. I want that very much. But Zane, what about my aunt? I cannot just abandon her. The boarding house is failing because of me. Your aunt could come with us, Zane suggested. The cabin is big enough and I could build an addition if needed, or if she wants to stay here, I have some money saved. I could help her through the winter, make sure she is taken care of. Helena's heart swelled. Here was a man thinking not just about her but about her family, about taking care of everyone she loved. You barely know my aunt. Why would you do that? Because she matters to you, Zane said, as if it were the simplest thing in the world. And because Margaret has been kind to me and kindness should be repaid. They talked until the sun began to sink toward the mountains, making plans and sharing dreams. Zane described his cabin in detail, the view from the porch, the nearby creek, the meadow where deer came to graze. Helena told him about her life in Chicago, about her father and her childhood, about her dreams of having a home where she belonged. When they returned to the boarding house, Margaret took one look at their faces and smiled. "So," she said, "when is the wedding?" Over dinner, they discussed practicalities. Margaret was adamant that she wanted to stay in Benton and try to make the boarding house work. "This is my home," she said firmly. "I will not let narrow-minded fools drive me out. But Helena, child, you should go. You deserve happiness, and Zane can give you that." Zane insisted on leaving Margaret with enough money to cover her expenses for 3 months. "It is not charity," he said when she protested. "It is family taking care of family, and you will be family soon." That night, after Zane had ridden back toward the mountains, Helena lay awake thinking about how quickly her life had changed. 3 weeks ago, she had been a pariah, alone and frightened. Now she had hope, a future, and the promise of a man who saw her as beautiful rather than cursed. The 2 weeks passed slowly. Helena helped her aunt and tried to avoid the townspeople as much as possible. Reverend Cartwright preached a sermon about the dangers of unnatural women, and everyone knew he meant her. Mrs. Dalton organized a petition to have Helena forced out of town, though thankfully it went nowhere since Margaret owned her property outright. But there were small kindnesses too. Mrs. Chen brought by a beautiful length of fabric, pale blue like a summer sky, saying it would make a fine wedding dress. The livery owner, Mr. Benton, a gruff man who rarely spoke, stopped Helena on the street to tell her that Zane Prescott was the most honest man he had ever met, and she was lucky to have him. Even Mr. Hutchins at the general store seemed slightly chastened after his encounter with Zane, and he treated Helena with grudging fairness when she came in for supplies. The morning Zane was due to return, Helena woke before dawn, too excited to sleep. She dressed carefully in her best day dress and did her hair, leaving it down because Zane had once said he liked it that way. Her hands trembled as she braided ribbons through it. Margaret hugged her tight. "You are making the right choice, child. I see the way he looks at you, the way you look at him. That is real and it is rare." "I will miss you," Helena said, tears threatening. "I will visit in the spring," Margaret promised, "and you will come down for supplies sometimes. This is not goodbye forever, just goodbye for now." Zane arrived at mid-morning, riding a large bay horse and leading a second, gentler mare. He had cleaned up, trimming his beard and wearing what were clearly his best clothes, though they were still rough by town standards. But to Helena, he looked perfect, strong and solid and real. "Are you ready?" he asked, dismounting and coming to stand before her. "I am ready," Helena confirmed. They loaded her few belongings onto the pack mule Zane had brought. Helena owned so little that everything fit easily. As they prepared to leave, a small crowd had gathered, drawn by curiosity. Helena could see the judgment on most faces, the disapproval, the certainty that she was making a terrible mistake. Then Reverend Cartwright pushed through the crowd, his face red with anger. "You cannot leave with this man unwed," he declared. "It is sinful, immoral." "They are getting married as soon as the circuit judge arrives," Margaret said firmly. "That could be weeks. She will be living in sin until then." Cartwright turned to the crowd. "Good people of Benton, we cannot allow this woman to leave and spread her corruption to the wilderness. She must stay here where we can watch her," the crowd muttered, and Helena felt fear spike through her. Surely they could not actually stop her from leaving. This was 1876, not the Dark Ages. She was a free woman. Zane stepped forward, placing himself between Helena and the Reverend. His size suddenly seemed much more imposing, his shoulders impossibly broad, his presence almost overwhelming. "Reverend, Miss Turner is free to go where she pleases with whom she pleases. If you try to stop her, you and I will have a problem. Are you threatening a man of God?" Cartwright sputtered. "I am telling you to mind your own business," Zane said, his voice calm but carrying an edge that made several men in the crowd step back. "Helena has done nothing wrong. She has committed no crime. She is simply leaving this town that has treated her poorly from the day she arrived. If you want to talk about sin, Reverend, maybe you should think about the sin of cruelty, of judging people on their appearance, of turning away someone in need of kindness." For a moment, silence hung over the crowd. Then Mr. Benson from the livery spoke up. "The mountain man is right. We have not been very Christian to this young lady. If she wants to leave, we have no right to stop her." Mrs. Chen appeared from somewhere in the crowd. "I wish her happiness. More than she has found here." Reverend Cartwright looked around, seeing he was losing control of the situation. "This town will suffer for harboring a witch," he pronounced darkly. "Mark my words, there will be consequences. The only consequence will be that we lose a good woman and prove ourselves to be exactly what she thinks we are," Mr. Benson said. "Goodbye, Miss Turner. I hope you find happiness in the mountains." It was not a ringing endorsement, but it was enough to break the tension. The crowd began to disperse, still muttering but no longer threatening. Helena hugged her aunt one last time, then allowed Zane to help her onto the mare. His hands on her waist were strong and steady, and when she was seated, he looked up at her with such warmth in his eyes that her breath caught. "Let us go home," he said simply. They rode out of Benton with the morning sun at their backs. Helena did not look back. She kept her eyes forward, on the mountains rising before them, on the future that waited in the high country with the man riding beside her. The journey took most of the day. They followed trails that climbed steadily upward, through forests of pine and aspen that blazed gold in the autumn light. Zane pointed out landmarks, telling her stories about the land, teaching her to read the forest the way he did. He showed her bare scratches on trees, elk trails through the underbrush, the signs of beaver dams in the creeks they crossed. "The land speaks if you know how to listen," he said. "It tells you where to hunt, where to find water when storms are coming. Up here, listening can mean the difference between life and death." Helena drank it all in, fascinated by this world so different from anything she had known. The air grew crisper as they climbed, scented with pine and the faint smoke of someone's distant campfire. Eagles circled overhead, and once they saw a small herd of elk grazing in a meadow, their heads lifting to watch the riders pass before returning to their grazing. As the sun began to sink toward the western peaks, they rounded a bend in the trail and Zane gestured ahead. "There, that is home." The cabin sat in a natural clearing, backed by tall pines with mountains rising beyond. It was larger than Helena had expected, built from solid logs chinked with clay, with a stone chimney from which smoke curled invitingly. A porch ran along the front, and she could see what looked like an addition built onto one side. The nearby creek Zane had mentioned sparkled in the fading light, and beyond the cabin, a meadow stretched away toward the tree line. "Oh, Zane," Helena breathed. "It is beautiful." Pride flickered across his face. "I built most of it myself, following my father's original structure. I added the extra room thinking I might need it for storage, but it can be a bedroom for us until we are married. I will sleep in the main room." He was thinking of her reputation, her comfort, even here where there was no one to see or judge. Helena felt her affection for this thoughtful man deepen even further. Inside, the cabin was surprisingly cozy. The main room held a stone fireplace, a rough-hewn table with benches, shelves lined with supplies, and a bed built into an alcove. The addition held another bed and more storage. Everything was clean and well maintained, speaking to Zane's care for his home. "I know it is not fancy," Zane said, suddenly seeming uncertain, "but it is warm and solid, and I will keep you safe here." "It is wonderful," Helena assured him. "It is more than I ever expected." Over the next few days, they fell into a rhythm. Zane taught Helena how to manage life in the mountains. She learned to read weather signs, to preserve meat, to identify edible plants and dangerous ones. He taught her to shoot his rifle, standing behind her to correct her stance, his solid presence both distracting and reassuring. She was a quick learner, and he praised her progress generously. In turn, Helena brought domestic comfort to the cabin. She cooked meals that were far better than Zane's bachelor fare. She organized his supplies more efficiently, mended his clothes, and added small touches that made the cabin feel more like a home. She found wildflowers that had not yet succumbed to frost and put them in a tin cup on the table. She sang while she worked, old songs her father had taught her, and Zane would stop what he was doing just to listen. They talked endlessly, learning each other's stories. Zane told her about growing up in the mountains with his father after his mother died of pneumonia. He had been 12 when she passed, and his father had dealt with grief by going deeper into the wilderness. Zane had grown up wild and free, learning to trap and hunt, to survive in conditions that would kill most men. Helena shared her own history, the happy early years with both parents, then the long stretch after her mother's death when it was just her and her father. She told him about the books she loved to read, her dream of maybe one day writing stories of her own. Zane immediately promised to bring her paper and ink on his next trip to town. 2 weeks after their arrival, Zane had to check his trap lines. "I will be gone 3 days," he said. "Will you be all right here alone?" "I will be fine," Helena assured him, though her heart sank at the thought of 3 days without his company. "I have the rifle, and you have taught me well." "There is a bell on the porch," Zane said seriously. "If anything happens, anything at all that frightens you, ring it. I will hear it even if I am miles away, and I will come running. You understand?" Helena nodded, touched by his concern. "I understand." Those 3 days were long. Helena kept busy with chores, but the cabin felt empty without Zane's presence. She realized how much she had come to depend on his company, his quiet strength, the way he made her feel valued and protected. At night, lying alone in the bed in the addition, she admitted to herself what she had been avoiding. She was falling in love with Zane Prescott. Perhaps she had been falling since that first day in the general store, when he had stood up for her without hesitation. When he returned on the evening of the 3rd day, Helena ran out to meet him. He dismounted and caught her in his arms, lifting her off her feet in an embrace that felt like coming home. "I missed you," she said against his chest. "I missed you too," he rumbled. "Every minute I was gone, I wanted to turn around and come back." He had brought fresh meat and something else, a small package wrapped in brown paper. "For you," he said, almost shyly. Inside was a beautiful length of lace, delicate and fine. "For your wedding dress," Zane explained. "I rode down to Benson's and asked his wife what a bride might need. She said lace was customary." Helena felt tears prick her eyes. This rough mountain man had ridden hours out of his way to get her lace for a wedding dress. "Thank you," she whispered. "It is perfect." That night they sat on the porch together, watching stars emerge in the darkening sky. The temperature had dropped, and Zane had draped a blanket around Helena's shoulders. She sat close to him, drawing comfort from his warmth. "Zane," she said quietly, "I need to tell you something." "What is it?" He turned to look at her, concern in his eyes. "I am in love with you," Helena said, the words tumbling out in a rush. I know it has only been a few weeks, and maybe it is too soon to be sure, but I am sure. I love you, and not just because you saved me from Benton or because you have been kind. I love the way you see the world, the way you move through it with such confidence and grace. I love your gentleness despite your strength, your thoughtfulness, your integrity. I love you, and I needed you to know that before we marry, so you know it is not just gratitude or convenience. Zane was quiet for a long moment, and Helena felt her heart begin to sink. Then he cupped her face in his large, calloused hands and looked at her with such intensity that she could barely breathe. "Helena Turner," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "I have been in love with you since the day you stood up to Hutchins in that store, refusing to be cheated. I fell harder when you laughed at my silly comment about trees not casting spells. Every day since then, I have loved you more. You are brave and kind and smart. You brought light and warmth into this cabin and into my life. I never thought I would find someone who could love this rough existence, but you have taken to it like you were born for it. I am honored that you love me, and I promise to spend the rest of my life being worthy of that love." He kissed her then, gentle at first, then deeper as she responded. It was her first kiss, and it felt like magic, like coming home, like every good thing she had ever dreamed of. When they finally pulled apart, both were breathing hard, and Zane's eyes were dark with something that made Helena's stomach flutter pleasantly. "The circuit judge comes through in 3 weeks," he said hoarsely. "That is going to be a very long 3 weeks." Helena laughed, feeling giddy with joy. "We have waited this long. We can wait a little longer." But waiting proved harder than either anticipated. Every day their connection grew stronger. They worked side by side, preparing the cabin for winter. Zane cut and stacked firewood while Helena preserved the last of the autumn harvest. They reinforced the barn where Zane kept his horses, repaired weak spots in the roof, and laid in supplies for the long winter ahead. And every night, they sat together by the fire, talking and dreaming and sharing kisses that grew increasingly heated before Zane would reluctantly pull away, reminding them both of his promise to behave honorably until they were wed. "You are making this very difficult," Helena teased one evening after a particularly passionate kiss left them both flushed and breathless. "You have no idea," Zane groaned. "But I will not dishonor you, Helena. When we come together as man and wife, it will be right and proper." His old-fashioned morality just made Helena love him more. In an age and place where many men would have taken advantage, Zane respected her enough to wait. It was yet another sign of his character, his essential goodness. 3 days before the judge was due to arrive, the first snow fell. Helena woke to find the world transformed, covered in a blanket of white that sparkled in the morning sun. Zane found her standing on the porch, staring in wonder. "It is beautiful," she breathed. "It is," he agreed, but he was looking at her rather than the snow. "Like everything else up here, it is dangerous too. That is why we needed to prepare. Winter in the high country is not forgiving." But standing there with Zane's arm around her waist, warm and safe, Helena felt no fear. Whatever challenges winter brought, they would face them together. The day the circuit judge was due, Zane and Helena rode down to Benton together. Helena wore the dress she had made from Mrs. Chen's fabric, trimmed with the lace Zane had given her. She had left her red hair down, flowing over her shoulders like a copper waterfall, because Zane loved it that way. And she was done hiding who she was to please people who would never accept her. The judge, a portly man named Morrison, was staying at Margaret's boarding house. Aunt Margaret cried when she saw Helena, hugging her tight and whispering how radiant she looked. "Marriage agrees with you, and you are not even married yet," Margaret teased. "Love agrees with me," Helena corrected, smiling at Zane. The ceremony was simple, held in Margaret's parlor with only Margaret, the judge, and Mr. and Mrs. Chen as witnesses. Zane had asked the Chens specially, knowing how kind they had been to Helena. Mrs. Chen had brought a beautiful embroidered cloth as a wedding gift, and Mr. Chen presented Zane with a bottle of rice wine for toasting. When Judge Morrison asked if anyone objected to the union, Reverend Cartwright burst through the door. "I object." "This woman is not your concern," Zane said, his voice like thunder. He did not move from Helena's side, but his entire posture radiated protective fury. "You have no standing here, Reverend. This is a legal proceeding, and unless you have legal cause to stop this wedding, you need to leave. Now." Judge Morrison frowned at Cartwright. "The mountain man is correct. Do you have legal cause?" Cartwright sputtered but could produce nothing. Judge Morrison nodded to the door. "Then I suggest you leave before I hold you in contempt." Cartwright left, but not before shooting Helena a look of pure venom. She pressed closer to Zane, who wrapped a protective arm around her. "Continue, please, Your Honor," Zane said. The ceremony proceeded without further interruption. When Judge Morrison pronounced them man and wife and told Zane he could kiss his bride, Helena felt her heart might burst with happiness. Zane's kiss was tender and full of promise, and when they pulled apart, both were smiling. "I love you, Mrs. Prescott," Zane said softly. "I love you, Mr. Prescott," Helena replied. They celebrated with a simple meal at the boarding house. Margaret had cooked Helena's favorite dishes, and the Chens brought delicacies from their own kitchen. It was small and intimate, but it was perfect because everyone there genuinely cared for the bride and groom. As the afternoon wore on, Zane and Helena prepared to return to the mountains. Margaret hugged Helena close. "Be happy, my dear girl. You deserve all the happiness in the world." "Come visit in the spring," Helena urged. "Promise me." "I promise," Margaret said. "The mountains will not keep me away." The ride back to the cabin took on new meaning now. Helena was no longer a guest in Zane's home. She was his wife, his partner, his equal. When they arrived at the cabin, Zane surprised her by sweeping her into his arms and carrying her across the threshold. "There," he said, setting her down gently. "Now it is official." The cabin felt different somehow, more intimate. Zane lit the fire while Helena changed out of her wedding dress into more practical clothes. When she emerged from the addition, Zane had laid out a simple supper and opened the Chen's rice wine. They ate slowly, talking quietly, the anticipation building between them. When the meal was finished and cleared away, Zane took Helena's hand and led her to the bed in the alcove. His hands shook slightly as he helped her out of her clothes, his touch reverent and gentle. "I will try not to hurt you," he said softly. "Tell me if I do something you do not like." Helena touched his bearded face. "I trust you completely." Their wedding night was tender and passionate, a joining that felt both natural and profound. Zane was patient and attentive, making sure Helena's pleasure matched his own. Afterward they lay tangled together, Helena's red hair spread across Zane's broad chest, both marveling at the intimacy they had shared. "I never imagined I could be this happy," Helena whispered. Zane kissed the top of her head. "Neither did I. I spent so many years alone I thought I was meant to be solitary. Then you walked into that store and everything changed." "Do you ever regret it?" Helena asked. "Taking on a wife, changing your whole life?" "Not for 1 second," Zane said firmly. "You are the best thing that ever happened to me, Helena. You make everything better just by being here." The winter that followed was harsh but magical. Snow piled high around the cabin, and temperatures dropped far below freezing. But inside, Helena and Zane created their own world of warmth and love. They spent long evenings by the fire, reading aloud from the books Helena had brought, telling stories, making plans for the future. Zane taught Helena more survival skills. She learned to snowshoe, to ice fish in the frozen creek, to recognize the signs of frostbite and hypothermia. She proved to be a quick study and a capable partner, and Zane often told her how proud he was of her adaptability. Helena brought culture and refinement to their mountain life. She taught Zane to appreciate poetry, read him stories from books he had never thought to pick up, helped him improve his reading and writing skills. She sang while she worked, filling the cabin with music, and sometimes in the evenings they would dance to songs she hummed. Zane's large frame surprisingly graceful as he swept her around the small space. They made love often, learning each other's bodies, discovering what brought pleasure, growing more comfortable and passionate with each encounter. Helena had been nervous about the physical aspect of marriage, but Zane's patience and genuine care for her well-being made it a source of joy rather than anxiety. As winter deepened, they were snowed in for weeks at a time. But Helena never felt trapped. With Zane, the cabin felt like the whole world, complete and perfect. They talked about everything and nothing, shared their dreams and fears, built a foundation of trust and understanding that would support them through whatever life brought. In late January, Helena began feeling unwell in the mornings. At first, she thought it was something she ate, but when the nausea persisted, a suspicion began to form. She was careful to track her monthly cycles and realized she had missed one, then two. "Zane," she said one evening as they sat by the fire, "I think I might be with child." Zane's head snapped up, his eyes going wide. "Truly, I cannot be certain without a doctor, but all the signs point to it," Helena said. "Are you pleased?" In answer, Zane pulled her into his arms, holding her so tight she could barely breathe. "Pleased? Helena, I am beyond pleased. A child, our child." He pulled back to look at her, his eyes suspiciously bright. "I am going to be a father," Helena laughed, feeling tears of joy on her own cheeks. "It appears so." From that moment, Zane became even more protective. He insisted Helena rest more, do less heavy work, take care of herself. Helena found his concern endearing, even when it became slightly overbearing. "I am pregnant, not made of glass," she teased when he objected to her carrying water from the creek. "I know, but humor me," Zane said. "I cannot help but worry. My mother died when I was young, and the mountains are no place for complications." Helena softened, understanding his fear. "I will be careful, I promise, but you have to let me stay active. It is not good to sit idle all day." They compromised, with Helena continuing her usual activities but allowing Zane to help with heavier tasks. As winter gave way to early spring, Helena's pregnancy became more obvious. She sewed new clothes to accommodate her growing belly, and Zane built a beautiful cradle from pine wood, sanding it until it was smooth as silk. When the snows finally melted enough to make travel possible, Zane rode down to Benton to fetch the doctor. Dr. Wyatt, a gruff but competent man, made the journey back to the cabin and examined Helena thoroughly. "You are healthy, Mrs. Prescott," he announced. "The baby appears to be developing well. I would estimate you are about 5 months along, which means the baby will come sometime in late June or early July. Will you be able to come when it is time?" Zane asked, his concern evident. "I will do my best," Wyatt said, "but mountain births can be unpredictable. Make sure you have plenty of clean cloths, hot water, and a plan in case I cannot get here in time." After the doctor left, Zane held Helena close. "I am terrified," he admitted. "What if something goes wrong? What if I cannot protect you?" "Life has risks," Helena said gently. "But we will face them together. Women have been having babies since the beginning of time. I am strong and you will be there with me. That is all I need." Spring brought new life to the mountains. The meadow near the cabin filled with wildflowers, and Helena spent hours gathering them, pressing some in books, weaving others into crowns she wore playfully. Her pregnancy agreed with her, giving her skin a luminous quality and making her eyes bright. Zane told her daily that she was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. Margaret visited in May as promised. She brought supplies, news from town, and most importantly, experience with childbirth. "I helped bring dozens of babies into this world," she told Helena. "I will stay through the birth if you want me." "I would love that," Helena said gratefully. Margaret settled into the addition, and her presence brought another dimension of warmth to the cabin. She and Zane got along well, united in their love for Helena and their determination to see her safely through childbirth. The labor began on a hot July afternoon. Helena had been feeling restless all day, unable to settle to any task. When the first contraction hit, she gripped the table and breathed through it. "It is time," she told Zane calmly. Zane's face went pale beneath his beard. "I will get Margaret. You sit down." "No, lie down. Should you lie down?" Despite the pain, Helena laughed. Zane breathed. "Everything is fine. This is natural. Just get my aunt." The labor lasted through the night and into the next day. Zane was beside himself with worry, pacing the main room while Margaret attended to Helena. Finally, Margaret let him in and he knelt beside the bed, holding Helena's hand while she gripped it hard enough to leave marks. "You are the strongest person I know," he told her between contractions. "You can do this." "I do not feel very strong right now," Helena gasped. "But you are. You left everything familiar to come to these mountains. You made a home here. You made me a better man just by loving me. You can do this too." His faith in her gave Helena strength. When Margaret finally said it was time to push, Helena bore down with all her might, Zane's voice in her ear telling her how brave she was, how much he loved her, how proud he was. Their son entered the world screaming his displeasure at the bright July morning. Margaret cleaned him quickly and placed him in Helena's arms. He had a shock of dark hair and lungs that could wake the dead, but he was perfect, beautiful, a miracle made of their love. Zane stared at his son with wonder written across his face. "We have a son," he whispered. "Helena, we have a son." "What should we name him?" Helena asked, exhausted but radiant. Zane thought for a moment. "My father's name was Matthew. What about Matthew James Prescott?" "Matthew James," Helena repeated. "It is perfect." They spent the next few days in a haze of new parenthood. Matthew was a hungry baby, nursing frequently and sleeping in short bursts. Zane was completely smitten, holding his son whenever Helena allowed it, staring at the tiny face with endless fascination. Margaret stayed for 3 weeks, teaching them the basics of baby care, helping Helena heal, making sure both mother and baby thrived. When she finally prepared to return to Benton, it was hard to say goodbye. "You have built a good life here," Margaret told Helena. "I am so proud of you, child. Your parents would be proud too. Come back soon," Helena urged. "Matthew should know his great-aunt." "Try to keep me away," Margaret said with a smile. The first year of Matthew's life flew by in a blur of sleepless nights and joyful days. Helena and Zane adapted to parenthood with surprising ease, working as a team to care for their son. Matthew grew into a happy, curious baby who loved being carried in the sling Helena fashioned, looking out at the mountains with wide eyes. When Matthew was 18 months old, Helena discovered she was pregnant again. This time she was less nervous, more confident in her ability to bring a child into the world. Their daughter, Emily Rose, was born in March during a late snowstorm, entering the world more peacefully than her brother, with Helena's red hair and Zane's storm-colored eyes. Zane was utterly enchanted by his daughter. She is going to break hearts, he declared, holding the tiny girl with infinite gentleness. Not until she is at least 30, Helena said firmly, making them both laugh. Life in the mountains continued, full and rich. Zane taught Matthew to track animals, to read the forest, to respect the wilderness. Helena taught both children to read and write, filling their minds with stories and knowledge. Emily proved to have her mother's love of learning and her father's physical strength, while Matthew had his father's quiet confidence and his mother's compassion. They made trips to Benton occasionally for supplies and to visit Margaret, who remained a constant presence in their lives. The town had changed somewhat over the years. Reverend Cartwright had moved on to terrorize another congregation, and new people had arrived who were less concerned with superstition. Some of the old-timers still gave Helena suspicious looks, but most people had come to respect the Prescott family and their choice to live in the high country. When Matthew was 5 and Emily 3, Helena became pregnant for the third time. This pregnancy was harder, and she was confined to bed rest for the last 2 months. Zane was beside himself with worry, but Margaret came to stay and help with the children, and Helena's natural strength carried her through. Their second son, Daniel, was born healthy and strong in September, completing their family. Zane built another addition onto the cabin, creating more space for their growing brood. The cabin that had once housed a solitary mountain man now rang with children's laughter, full of life and love. Years passed in a rhythm of seasons, winters by the fire telling stories, springs watching the meadow bloom, summers exploring the mountains, autumns preparing for the cold to come. The children grew tall and capable, learning to thrive in the wilderness that was their home. Matthew inherited his father's height and strength, becoming a skilled hunter and tracker. Emily developed her mother's quick mind and her father's physical prowess, equally comfortable with books and outdoor adventures. Daniel, the youngest, had a gift for working with animals and a laugh that could lighten any mood. Helena and Zane grew older together, their love deepening with each passing year. They knew each other completely, could communicate with a look, worked together as seamlessly as two parts of a whole. On their 10th anniversary, Zane took Helena back to the spot where he had first told her that her beauty outshone every sunset. "I was right that day," he said, pulling her close. 10 years, 3 children, countless sunsets, and you still outshine them all. Helena laughed and kissed him. "You are still the most romantic mountain man I have ever met." "I am the only mountain man you have ever met," Zane pointed out. "Well, then I chose wisely," Helena said. They stood together watching the sun sink toward the western peaks, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. Their children were back at the cabin, probably causing some kind of mischief. But for this moment, it was just the two of them, husband and wife, best friends, partners in everything. "Do you ever regret it?" Zane asked suddenly. "Leaving civilization, living this hard life, raising children in the wilderness." Helena looked up at her husband, at the face she loved more than any other, lined now with years but still strong, still kind, still hers. "Not for 1 second. This life, this family, it is everything I ever dreamed of and more than I knew to hope for. Even though the town called you a witch, especially because of that," Helena said, "because it brought me to you, because it taught me that I am stronger than other people's prejudice. Because our children are growing up knowing that what matters is character, not appearance, and that love matters more than anything else." Zane pulled her closer, resting his chin on top of her head. "I spent years alone in these mountains thinking I did not need anyone. Then you walked into my life, and I realized I had just been waiting for you all along." As the sun slipped below the horizon, Helena thought about the journey that had brought her here. From the frightened young woman stepping off a stagecoach in Benton to the confident mother and wife she was now. It had not been easy, but every challenge had been worth it. When they returned to the cabin, the children were indeed causing mischief, having attempted to make supper and created a floury disaster instead. But Helena just laughed and helped clean up while Zane organized the troops to actually cook something edible. This was her life, chaotic and messy and absolutely perfect. The years continued to roll by. Matthew grew into a man and eventually married a girl from Benton, a smart young woman named Sarah who took to mountain life with the same adaptability Helena had shown. They built their own cabin a few miles from Zane and Helena, close enough for family but far enough for independence. Their children, Zane and Helena's grandchildren, brought new joy and energy to the family. Emily proved more independent, choosing to stay unmarried into her 20s, much to the consternation of various young men who tried to court her. "I will know when I meet the right person," she told her parents. "Until then, I am perfectly happy as I am." Daniel eventually became a veterinarian, studying in the East before returning to Montana Territory to practice. He married a fellow doctor, a woman named Catherine who shared his passion for healing, and they settled in Benton where they could serve the community. Helena and Zane grew old together in their mountain cabin, surrounded by family, secure in the knowledge that they had built something lasting and good. Helena's red hair silvered over the years, but Zane still told her she was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. His shoulders remained broad, his strength enduring even as age slowed him slightly. On their 30th anniversary, the entire family gathered at the cabin. Children, grandchildren, even Margaret, now in her 80s but still sharp as a tack, made the journey. They feasted and laughed and told stories late into the night. As the celebration wound down and family members found places to sleep scattered throughout the expanded cabin and the nearby buildings, Helena and Zane slipped out to the porch. The summer night was warm, filled with the sound of crickets and the distant call of an owl. 30 years, Helena said wonderingly. "It feels like both forever and no time at all." "Best 30 years of my life," Zane said, wrapping an arm around her waist. "Every single day with you has been a gift." Helena leaned into him, feeling the solid warmth that had been her comfort and support for 3 decades. "You remember that first day in the general store, when you stood up to Mr. Hutchins for me? I remember thinking you were the bravest person I had ever seen, refusing to be cheated," Zane said. "And I remember thinking your hair looked like fire and autumn leaves and sunset all at once." "The town called me a witch for that hair," Helena said softly. "And I said your beauty outshone every sunset," Zane finished. "I meant it then and I mean it now. You have given me a life I never dreamed possible, Helena. 3 incredible children, grandchildren, a home full of love. You took a lonely mountain man and made him the richest man in the territory." "We made each other rich," Helena corrected. "You gave me safety and acceptance when the world turned cruel. You saw me when others only saw what they feared. You loved me when I needed love most." They stood together on the porch they had stood on countless times before, watching stars emerge in the darkening sky. Inside the cabin, their legacy slept children and grandchildren who would carry forward the values of strength, kindness, and love that Helena and Zane had instilled in them. "What do you think happens next?" Helena asked. "We are getting older, Zane." Eventually is not today," Zane said firmly. "And when that time comes, we will face it the same way we have faced everything else together. But until then, I plan to spend every moment I have left telling you I love you and watching sunsets that still do not compare to you." Helena smiled, tears gathering in her eyes. "I love you too. More than words can express. You were my salvation and my home, Zane Prescott. You still are." They kissed under the stars, a kiss that held 30 years of love, passion, partnership, and commitment. When they finally pulled apart, both were smiling. "Come on, Mrs. Prescott," Zane said. "Let us go to bed. Tomorrow our grandchildren will be up at dawn demanding breakfast and stories, and we need our rest." Helena laughed and let him lead her inside, past the sleeping forms of their family, to the bedroom they had shared for 3 decades. As she settled into bed with Zane's arms around her, Helena thought about the journey that had brought her here. From outcast to beloved wife and mother. From frightened outsider to confident mountain woman. From loneliness to belonging. The town had called her a witch for her red hair, seeing only something to fear. But Zane had seen beauty, had said her loveliness outshone every sunset in his beloved mountains. And in doing so, he had given her the greatest gift possible, the freedom to be herself, fully and completely accepted. They fell asleep as they had for 30 years, wrapped in each other's arms, secure in their love. Outside, the mountains stood eternal, keeping watch over the cabin where a lonely man and a rejected woman had found each other and built a love that would echo through generations. The next morning dawned bright and clear. Helena woke to the sound of her grandchildren playing outside, their laughter floating through the open window. Zane still slept beside her, his face peaceful in repose, and she took a moment just to look at him. Even after 30 years, the sight of him made her heart swell with love. She slipped out of bed quietly, not wanting to wake him. In the main room, she found Emily already up, making coffee and organizing breakfast for the assembled crowd. "Morning, Mama," Emily said, kissing her mother's cheek. "Did you sleep well?" "Like a log," Helena said. "How many people do we need to feed this morning, counting everyone?" "About 20, Emily laughed. "Our family has grown, hasn't it?" Helena looked around at the cabin, bursting with the people she and Zane had created, directly or indirectly. Every person here was part of their legacy, proof that love and acceptance could create something beautiful and lasting. Throughout the day, family members gradually departed, heading back to their own homes and lives. By evening, only Zane and Helena remained, the cabin feeling suddenly quiet after the bustle of the celebration. "Too quiet?" Zane asked, coming up behind Helena as she stood at the window watching the sunset. "A little," Helena admitted, "but also nice. I love our family, but I also love it being just us." "Come outside," Zane said, taking her hand. "The sunset is particularly beautiful tonight." They walked out to their favorite spot, the meadow near the cabin where wildflowers still bloomed in profusion. The western sky was ablaze with color, reds and golds and purples painting the heavens in bold strokes. "Beautiful," Helena breathed. "Not as beautiful as you," Zane said, as he had said countless times before. But the words never got old, never felt less meaningful. If anything, they meant more after 3 decades of love and partnership. Helena turned to look at her husband, this man who had saved her in every way that mattered. His hair was silver now, his face lined with years of sun and weather, but his eyes were still the same storm cloud gray-blue, still filled with love when he looked at her. "Thank you," she said softly. "For what?" "For seeing me when no one else would. For loving me when I felt unlovable. For building this life with me. For 30 years of being my partner, my protector, my best friend, and my love. For everything, Zane. Thank you for everything." Zane pulled her into his arms, holding her close as the sun sank lower. "You do not need to thank me for the privilege of loving you, Helena. It has been the greatest honor of my life." They stood together until the last light faded from the sky and stars began to emerge. Then, hand in hand, they walked back to the cabin, to the home they had built together, to the life they had created against all odds. Inside, Zane built up the fire while Helena made tea. They sat together in comfortable silence. No words needed after so many years of understanding each other perfectly. This was what they had built, not just a family, not just a home, but a love that had weathered every storm and grown stronger with each passing year. As Helena prepared for bed that night, she caught sight of herself in the small mirror hanging on the wall. Her red hair was silver now, her face lined with age, but her eyes were happy. She had lived a good life, a full life, a life rich with love and meaning. Zane appeared behind her in the mirror, wrapping his arms around her waist. "What are you thinking about? How lucky I am," Helena said. "That stagecoach brought me to Benton feeling frightened and alone. The town called me a witch, treated me with cruelty and suspicion. But it also brought me to you, and you changed everything." "We changed everything together," Zane corrected. "You made me see that my life could be more than just surviving alone in the wilderness. You showed me what love and partnership truly meant. You gave me a family, a purpose, a reason to be grateful for every single day." They stood together, reflected in the mirror, two people who had found each other against impossible odds and built something beautiful together. A mountain man and a red-haired woman the town had called a witch. A love story that proved the power of acceptance, kindness, and seeing past the surface to the beauty within. Helena turned in Zane's arms, reaching up to cup his bearded face in her hands. "I love you, Zane Prescott, today, tomorrow, and for every day I have left on this earth." "And I love you, Helena Prescott," he replied, using the name she had carried with pride for 30 years. "More than all the sunsets in all the mountains, more than anything else in this world, I love you." They kissed, a kiss that held decades of love and passion and partnership. And in that moment, in their cabin in the mountains with their legacy secure and their love stronger than ever, both knew they had found what everyone searches for: true belonging, acceptance, and a love that transcends all obstacles. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting dancing shadows on the walls. Outside, the mountains stood eternal under the starlit sky. And inside, Zane and Helena Prescott, the mountain man and the woman with red hair, held each other close, grateful for every moment of the journey that had brought them together and the life they had built in the wilderness they called home. Their story was complete, not with dramatic gestures or grand adventures, but with the quiet satisfaction of lives well lived, love freely given and generously returned, and a family built on foundations of respect, acceptance, and devotion. They had proven that true beauty lies not in conforming to others' expectations, but in having the courage to be yourself and finding someone who loves you for exactly who you are. As they climbed into bed together, both felt a deep contentment. Whatever tomorrow brought, whatever challenges the future held, they would face them together as they always had. And that knowledge, that certainty of partnership and love, was worth more than all the gold in Montana territory. Helena fell asleep wrapped in Zane's strong arms, safe and loved, exactly where she belonged. And Zane held his wife close, grateful beyond measure for the day she had stepped off that stagecoach and into his life, bringing light and warmth and love to a lonely mountain man who had not even known what he was missing. Their love story, born in adversity and strengthened through challenge, stood as a testament to the power of acceptance and the beauty of seeing past the surface to the heart within. The town had called her a witch for her red hair, but Zane had said her beauty outshone every sunset. And in choosing to believe him over them, Helena had found her happily ever after in the mountains of Montana territory, with a mountain man whose love proved stronger than any prejudice or fear.